Kyle never thought his fight for the truth would turn into a deadly trap. The colleagues he shared his workdays with betrayed him for their own careers. The company offered him a huge sum of money to stay quiet, but the way he refused turned his life upside down. No one expected his loved ones to turn their backs on him after that, and he himself was on the brink of destruction. But what he did next shocked everyone and forever changed the rules of the game. Let's go back to the very beginning. Kyle sat at his desk in the corner of the office, staring at the computer screen, but his thoughts were far away. Yesterday, he had finished working late on a new project that could have been a breakthrough for the company. It wasn't just an idea. It was the result of weeks of hard work, data analysis, and the creation of a unique concept that could revolutionize the company's product. But today, as he entered the conference room for the morning meeting, he felt everything had changed. The colleagues who usually ignored him now suddenly showed interest. But it wasn't friendly attention. It felt more cautious, almost distrustful. He sat in his chair, clutching the printed presentation in his hands. Just a minute ago, he had been confident, ready to share his idea. But as soon as Andrew started speaking, everything crumbled. With every word his colleague said, Kyle felt the ground slipping from under his feet. Andrew was presenting his project, describing the ideas as his own. Kyle remained silent, his mind racing. This is a mistake, right? He couldn't have done this, he thought. But when Andrew finished and the whole team began to congratulate him, the reality sank in. It was intentional. His project, his idea, his work, all now belonged to someone else. Rage boiled inside him. He barely held back from standing up and shouting at Andrew. But instead, as usual, he chose silence. He looked at the faces of his colleagues, noting their indifference to his presence. Racism, hidden behind friendly smiles, permeated every corner of the room. Once again, Kyle felt invisible, and that feeling deepened his despair. He wanted to get up and leave, but he couldn't. His job depended on this company, and he feared that any sign of discontent could cost him his place. He returned to his desk, feeling the weight of injustice growing heavier every day. Why do I always stay silent? Why do I let them treat me this way? Kyle asked himself, but there was no answer. He knew one thing: this couldn't go on. A few days passed, but the pain of betrayal didn't go away. Kyle continued to come to work, avoiding the eyes of his colleagues. Every time he saw Andrew, his throat tightened with anger. The internal dialogue didn't stop. Should I fight back? Or is it safer to endure it for the sake of my security? He felt torn apart by the inner conflict. On one hand, he wanted to go to management and expose Andrew. On the other hand, he knew it could backfire. How many times had similar stories ended badly for those who tried to stand up for justice? Kyle remembered the conversations about how other black employees had been treated unfairly. The invisible barrier between him and his white colleagues was always present. Every time he tried to propose an idea, it seemed like no one heard him. But when those same ideas were suggested by someone else, they were immediately accepted. It was a game in which he was never acknowledged as a full participant. One evening, staying late at work, Kyle sat in the empty office, illuminated only by the dim light of his desk lamp. He flipped through his notebook with project notes. One thought kept running through his mind. I deserve recognition for my work. Why should I stay silent? But at the same time, he felt the heavy weight of fear. If I start fighting, they will destroy me, he told himself. Finally, Kyle decided that the first thing he had to do was gather evidence. He began documenting his ideas, meeting dates and correspondences with colleagues, hoping that one day this could serve as his protection. Determination was growing inside him, but fear still lingered. He wasn't sure if he had the courage to see it through to the end. Weeks passed since that ill-fated meeting, and the tension between Kyle and Andrew only intensified. Every time they crossed paths in the hallway, Kyle felt Andrew's smug gaze. But today, what Kyle feared most became known. Andrew had been promoted for Kyle's project. It was official. Their boss gathered all the employees for a meeting and announced the news. Kyle sat in his office, staring at the computer screen where a message from the company's internal investigation department was displayed. After months of fighting, meetings, public speaking, and endless waiting, the day had finally come when Kyle would learn the results of his efforts. Slowly, he clicked on the email and began reading. As a result of the investigation, several high-ranking managers have been suspended for proven instances of discrimination. The company is implementing new anti-discrimination policies, effective immediately. Kyle froze for a moment, taking in what had just happened. He had achieved what he once thought was impossible. His fight, which had started with a single unjust incident, had now led to real changes within the system. This was more than just a personal victory. It was the kind of systemic change he had been fighting for. He had pushed the company to take responsibility for years of ignored racism. But with the sense of accomplishment came a wave of exhaustion. Kyle felt drained after months of struggle. He couldn't believe that this day had finally come. After reading the email to the end, he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. A new, lighter feeling of victory began to surface within him, but despite that, a voice inside reminded him that this was only the beginning, and there was still much work to be done. That evening, Kyle sat in the kitchen with Kira, sharing the results of the investigation. She smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "I always knew you could do it," she said, holding his hand. "This is your victory. You've changed the system." But despite the satisfaction, Kyle felt that this moment wasn't the end of his journey. "I understand that this is an important step," he said, staring at his coffee cup. "But this doesn't mean all the problems have been solved. It's only the beginning, Kira. Now that the company is being forced to change, we need to ensure these changes have real impact. It's one thing to announce new rules, but another to make sure they're actually enforced." Kira listened carefully, understanding the weight of his words. "You're right," she agreed, "but you've already proven that one person can make a big difference. You've inspired others, and now this fight is no longer just yours." Kyle knew Kira was right. His actions had started to influence others. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now finding their courage. But with that realization came a new feeling, a sense of responsibility for those who now looked to him as a symbol of the fight. He couldn't allow himself to back down. He had to keep pushing to ensure that this victory wasn't just a temporary win, but the start of real, lasting change for everyone. Weeks passed after the company announced its measures to combat discrimination. The cases Kyle had highlighted were actively being investigated, and those who had experienced injustice were finally given a platform to share their experiences. However, Kyle knew his fight didn't end there. He began taking a more active role in public forums, speaking to other companies and organizations about implementing similar anti-discrimination policies. His name had become associated with the movement for workplace equality, and with that came new challenges. One evening, he received an invitation to speak at a major conference on social justice. He had been asked to deliver a keynote speech in front of hundreds of people, marking an important step in his new life. On the stage, in front of a crowd, Kyle felt a slight nervousness, but was filled with determination. He reflected on the journey he had taken, from the day his ideas were stolen to the moment he refused the company's offer to buy his silence. He knew that this moment wasn't just about his personal victory. It was about everyone who fought for justice every day. "My story isn't just about one person," he began. "It's about how a system can be changed if we have the courage to speak the truth. We all deserve equality and justice, and I'm not here to celebrate victory, but to remind everyone. The fight for justice is ongoing. Each one of us can be part of it." His speech was met with applause. Kyle understood that his path now represented the path of many, and that his actions could change not only one company, but an entire system. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of a new one in which Kyle was no longer alone in his fight. Kyle sat at his desk again, his eyes on the computer screen, but his thoughts were far from the office. He replayed recent events in his mind, recalling moments when his work was unjustly ignored or outright stolen. His colleagues seemed oblivious to how his ideas were either lost in the collective silence or taken by others. But for Kyle, this wasn't just neglect. It was a sign of the systemic racism that pervaded the company. The sharp sting of disappointment and injustice hit him hard as he realized this wasn't just a coincidence. Every day, he watched as his white colleagues were praised and promoted for ideas that were often born in his head. But whenever he suggested something, his words disappeared into silence, leaving only bitterness behind. His internal conflict was growing. He knew he had to do something. But what? Should he speak out openly about racism? That could ruin his career. Losing his job was not something he could afford, but staying silent was becoming unbearable. His hands trembled the first time he secretly photographed a corporate email that blatantly showed a preference for white candidates for leadership positions. This was his first step. Kyle knew he needed more evidence. Over the next few days, he began secretly recording conversations with colleagues, capturing moments when their behavior revealed implicit but undeniable signs of discrimination. His inner turmoil deepened. He felt guilty, as if he were betraying the trust of his co-workers, but at the same time, he knew this was the only way to end the injustice. Every time Kyle saw his co-workers at the office, he had the eerie feeling that they knew something. He caught strange looks directed his way, but understood that these were probably just his own fears. Inside, a fierce battle was waging. He began to doubt whether he was doing the right thing by collecting this evidence. Was he being paranoid? What if he was overreacting? But each time he doubted himself, he remembered how his ideas were forgotten, or worse, openly claimed by others. One day during lunch, Kyle overheard two colleagues discussing Andrew's new project. He noticed one of them say, "Yeah, Andrew really came up with a great concept. He's definitely someone with ideas." It was more than Kyle could bear. His heart clenched with anger and helplessness, and he abruptly stood up from the table. The colleagues sitting nearby looked at him in surprise, but Kyle had already left the room, seeking a quiet place to gather his thoughts. "I can't stand this anymore," he whispered to himself, trying to calm his breathing. But how far was he willing to go? Should he really pass on the evidence he'd gathered to the journalists? After all, this could jeopardize not only his job, but also his reputation. He had seen how his white colleagues turned a blind eye to problems and discrimination. It was comfortable for them in this system, as it worked in their favor. But for Kyle, it was a source of constant oppression. As he sat in the empty hallway, a crucial thought occurred to him. If I don't start fighting now, this system will continue to exist. This isn't just my fight. It's a fight for everyone who faces racism in companies like this, Kyle told himself. It wasn't just personal. This was a systemic crisis that demanded action. Kyle stared at his computer screen for a long time. An email was open, ready to send. Attached were all the pieces of evidence he had gathered. photos of documents, audio recordings of conversations, and messages from colleagues showing a clear preference for white employees. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands trembled slightly. This was a critical decision that could change his entire life. He hesitated again, but memories of endless days of humiliation and being ignored gave him strength. He knew he was risking everything: his career, his income, and perhaps even his personal safety. The system was powerful, and challenging it could destroy him. But at the same time, Kyle understood that he could no longer remain silent. This was about more than just his career. It was about not allowing racism to control his life. He took a deep breath and pressed send. The email was gone. There was no turning back now. Soon, Kyle received a response from the journalist he had entrusted with his story. The journalist was stunned by the scale of the problem and promised to conduct a thorough investigation. When Kyle read these words, a bitter smile appeared on his face. He knew that the system could no longer simply sweep this under the rug. Despite his fear, Kyle felt a sense of relief. He had done what needed to be done. It might not change everything immediately, but he knew that the first step had been taken. Now, he was no longer just an observer in the system. He was its disruptor. Kyle sat in his small corner office, looking at his monitor. He had the feeling that today would be special, but he couldn't quite say why. Everything seemed normal. Employees walked past without noticing him. Keyboards clicked quietly in the open office space. But today, he knew things weren't so simple. On his computer screen, among dozens of ordinary emails, an article appeared, the one he had been waiting for. The journalist had published the piece exposing the company's racist practices. Right in front of him was proof that his efforts had not been in vain. A sense of relief mixed with anxiety. This was the moment of truth. He knew the truth was out, but what would the reaction be? He felt his hands tremble on the keyboard as he skimmed the article. Every word carried weight. Every line gave him a sense of justice, finally being spoken. But behind this relief was the understanding that the consequences would soon follow. He knew that such revelations rarely came without repercussions for those who initiated them. Colleagues passing by his desk were acting differently than usual. Some simply avoided eye contact, as if they didn't want to engage in conversation, while others looked at him with open suspicion. He felt like a stranger among people he had worked with for years. But he knew this was necessary. His inner struggle for the truth was more important than this social isolation. Kyle prepared himself for the fact that he was now an outcast to many who once considered him just a colleague. Now he was more than that. He had become a symbol of the fight for justice. The next day, the atmosphere in the office was tense. The article had caught the attention of not only the employees, but also the management. Whispers filled the building, and the tension was palpable. Colleagues who had approached Kyle with project questions just yesterday were now avoiding his gaze. Even those who had seemed friendly now appeared to be afraid of being seen next to him. Fear had gripped them. The fear of losing their jobs, the fear of facing the same injustice that Kyle had endured for so long. Amid these whispers and disapproving glances, Kyle met Andrew, the man whose audacity and immorality had sparked his fight. They ran into each other in the hallway, and Andrew, usually confident and indifferent, now looked irritated. His gaze was sharp, and his voice, when he spoke, trembled with suppressed anger. "You think that by publishing that article, you're going to change anything?" Andrew spat out angrily, cornering Kyle in the hallway. "You're just putting everything we have at risk. You're thinking about yourself and your truth, but you're forgetting about the people who depend on this company." Kyle took a deep breath, trying to control the rising anger. He understood that Andrew was just a part of the system, and his words were driven by fear, the same fear that now consumed him. "You're right," Kyle answered calmly, though his voice trembled slightly. "But I'm thinking about all those people who, like me, have endured injustice for years. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. And if I don't start speaking up, no one will." Andrew squinted, clearly unhappy with this response. He stepped back, but his eyes burned with resentment. Kyle knew this wouldn't be their last encounter, but a growing sense of confidence filled him. The truth couldn't be silenced. His fight was no longer just personal. Later that day, Kyle was called in for a meeting with the CEO. Anxiety flared up again in his chest, but he was ready. He knew he was now the center of attention, and a meeting with top management was only a matter of time. Walking through the halls, which now felt cold and foreign, he entered the CEO's spacious office. The CEO sat behind his large wooden desk, carefully reviewing documents handed to him by HR and legal. He didn't immediately look up at Kyle, but when he did, his gaze was sharp and severe. "Kyle," the CEO began, folding his hands on the desk, "the article that came out today has raised a lot of questions for our leadership. We understand this could seriously affect the company's reputation." He paused, trying to gauge Kyle's reaction. "You do realize your actions could have serious consequences, both for the company and for yourself." Kyle felt his heart race, but he suppressed his fear and met his boss's eyes. "I understand," he said firmly, "but I also understand that silence only makes the problem worse. We can't keep ignoring racism and injustice. I'm not backing down." The CEO squinted. He hadn't expected such confidence from Kyle, but he knew this conversation couldn't end with a simple warning. "You must realize the company might consider sanctions against you," he added coldly. "We can't let actions like this damage our reputation." Kyle knew this was a turning point. He realized he could lose his job, but no matter what happened, he was ready to keep fighting. "If sanctions are the price of truth, I'm willing to pay it," he said firmly, "but I won't back down." In that office, filled with luxury and the coldness of power, Kyle understood that fear of the system no longer had control over him. His fight was bigger than his career. It was about truth and justice for everyone. Kyle sat on the edge of his chair in the small office, gripping his phone. There was a strange sense of dread that hung over him that day. Something was off. In the past few weeks, his life had turned into a whirlwind of emotions and events, and it seemed that the support of his friends was his only stable refuge. But today, everything changed. One of his colleagues had called, warning him that someone he trusted had revealed his role in leaking information to the journalists. In that moment, Kyle's world collapsed. "Mark, ... Kyle whispered, struggling to process what he had just heard. Mark wasn't just a colleague. He had been working side by side with him for years. He was the one who had supported him through tough moments and seemed to share his values. How could he do this? Kyle replayed the words in his head, unable to accept the reality. The bitter sting of betrayal filled his chest. The feeling of loneliness became unbearable. Kyle realized that his fight for justice was driving people away from him, but he never thought it would extend to those he trusted. Now, faced with betrayal, he was truly alone against a system that had already begun to condemn him. His thoughts swirled in his mind, and at that moment, he felt like he had been betrayed, not only as a colleague, but as a human being. The pain was cutting deep into his heart. The disappointment and hurt of betrayal overwhelmed Kyle, and he couldn't focus on his work for the rest of the day. His mind raced between the feeling of injustice and the realization of his vulnerability. With each passing minute, the pressure grew stronger. That evening, when the office had emptied out, Kyle sat alone. He mulled over his options. Leave? That seemed like the logical choice. They already knew about his role in the leak. The system could easily destroy his career without giving him a chance to explain. But leaving would mean giving up. It would be admitting defeat to the injustice he had been fighting. What made it even more painful was the thought that if he left, the issue would disappear with him. The company would continue to operate under the same rules, turning a blind eye to racism. A sudden ring of his phone interrupted his thoughts. It was Mark, the very person who had betrayed him. Kyle hesitated to answer, but finally picked up. Mark's voice was heavy. "Kyle," Mark started, avoiding pauses as if afraid of being accused. "I know what I did, and I know it's a betrayal, but you have to understand, they forced me." Kyle struggled to contain his emotions. He wanted to shout, but his voice remained calm. "They forced you?" Kyle replied bitterly. "You could have said no, but you chose another path." Mark tried to explain that he had been given an ultimatum: either reveal the information, or he himself would face consequences. But that didn't ease Kyle's pain. "I trusted you, Mark. You were one of the few I trusted in this company," Kyle continued, his voice filled with hurt. "But now I see. No one stands for the truth when they're afraid of losing something." This conversation marked the end of Kyle's internal struggle. He realized he was truly alone, but it only strengthened his resolve. Leaving was not the solution. He had to stay, despite the threats and despite the betrayal. The next morning, as Kyle walked through the office doors, he felt a heavy weight on his shoulders, but also a new sense of determination. He knew he was going to be called into a meeting with management, knew he would face judgment, and possibly even lose his job. But that fear no longer controlled him. The meeting with the director was inevitable. When he was summoned to the office, Kyle could feel the tense atmosphere. The company's leader sat behind his desk alongside an HR representative. They avoided looking at him as he entered, which immediately told Kyle that this would be a difficult conversation. "Kyle," the director began after a long pause, "the situation we find ourselves in, due to the leak of information, could seriously damage the company's reputation. We have reason to believe you were one of those who provided that information to the journalists." Kyle nodded. He wasn't going to deny his role. "Yes, I passed on the information," he said calmly, though inside him everything was boiling. "Because what's happening here can no longer stay in the shadows." The director frowned, and the HR representative was carefully watching his every word. "You understand that this could lead to your dismissal?" the director asked. Kyle paused, took a deep breath, and looked his boss in the eyes. "I'm ready to face any consequences," he said firmly. "But if this company continues to ignore racism and injustice, then that will be on your conscience." His words hung in the air. The silence in the room was so profound, it seemed as if all the sounds in the world had disappeared. The director across from him looked conflicted. No one had expected Kyle to stand so firmly. He was prepared for whatever might come, and that made everyone else pause. "We'll take that into consideration," the director finally said, his voice slightly unsteady. "For now, you'll stay in your position, but your actions will have consequences for everyone." Kyle left the office feeling a small victory. Temporary, perhaps, but a victory nonetheless. He knew that fighting for justice would always come with betrayals, disappointments, and threats, but he was ready for the road ahead. He wasn't going to give up, and this decision had changed him forever. Every morning, as Kyle walked through the office doors, he felt something new, a coldness that wasn't connected to the air temperature. It was a sense of rejection and hidden contempt that began to manifest in every glance and gesture from his colleagues. Since he had openly started his fight against racist practices within the company, the atmosphere had shifted. His battle for justice, which to him was a matter of honor and morality, had become a source of mockery and ridicule for others. Whenever Kyle entered a conference room or passed colleagues in the hallway, he caught their stares, sometimes mocking, other times contemptuous. Some spoke about him in whispers, but loudly enough for him to hear. These were cruel jokes, disguised as harmless comments. "Look, the hero has arrived," Kyle overheard as he walked by a group of co-workers one day. One of them, Josh, gave him a dismissive once-over, and, looking in his direction, added, "Think you're gonna change anything here, Kyle? Maybe you'll write another little article." Kyle felt the fire of anger building inside him, but he didn't respond. He knew these people didn't understand his intentions. He saw fear behind their jokes, the fear that if his fight succeeded, their comfortable reality would collapse. Ignoring it wasn't easy. Every day was a new challenge. Every conversation, every meeting was filled with an unspoken tension. His colleagues kept their distance, but when they spoke to him, it was always with biting remarks. But Kyle couldn't allow himself to break. He knew that these jokes were just a new form of resistance to his ideas, and if he started reacting to them, it would only strengthen their impact. Yet, with every joke, his patience wore thinner. At the next team meeting, the tension was particularly high. Everyone knew that the situation in the company was becoming increasingly volatile. The investigation into racist practices was ongoing, and some people were beginning to fear the consequences. But instead of addressing the problem openly, they chose to ignore it and ridicule those who fought against the system. During Kyle's presentation on a new project, Andrew, who sat in the corner of the room, saw an opportunity to strike when the team's attention was focused on Kyle. "So, Kyle," Andrew said loudly, "if we go with your idea, you're not going to run to the journalists, are you?" The room fell silent, and a few chuckles broke out from various corners, but tension hung in the air. Kyle slowly turned his head toward Andrew. There was no anger in his eyes, just exhaustion and disappointment. He knew Andrew wasn't just joking. He was trying to humiliate Kyle in front of the entire team, to show that his fight didn't matter. "Are you serious, Andrew?" Kyle asked quietly, but there was something in his voice that made the laughter stop. "Do you really think this is funny? Do you think the problem we're facing is a joke?" Andrew smirked and shrugged. "Relax, Kyle. We're here to work, not play Revolution. Your articles are just your way of getting attention." Kyle felt his heart race, but he forced himself to remain calm. He was at a crossroads. He could either respond with the anger he felt, or maintain his composure. His internal battle reached its peak. Everything he had worked for could crumble with one emotional outburst. But he knew his silence could also speak volumes. It would show that he wasn't giving up. "If you don't understand that fighting for equality isn't a game, then you'll never understand," Kyle replied, maintaining his calm. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop." Andrew froze for a moment, not expecting such firmness. The room once filled with awkward silence. No one laughed anymore. Kyle realized that, despite the mockery, his words were starting to resonate. People in the room were beginning to see that he wasn't just some revolutionary, as Andrew had called him, but a person who wouldn't back down in the face of injustice. When the meeting ended, Kyle left the conference room, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. He had stood his ground, despite the ridicule and attempts to humiliate him. He walked back to his desk when he was approached by one of his colleagues, a young employee named Oliver, who had only been with the company for a short time. Normally reserved and quiet, Oliver now looked nervous but determined. "Kyle," he began, lowering his voice, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you're saying is important. I've watched how you've stood up for your principles, even with all this going on, and it made me think, I want to help." Kyle looked at Oliver in surprise. It was unexpected, but at the same time, deeply inspiring. One person from the team had shown courage and a willingness to stand by him. "Thank you, Oliver," Kyle said quietly, smiling slightly. "That means a lot." This moment became a turning point in his battle. Kyle realized that his actions were starting to have an effect, even if it wasn't immediately obvious. He was no longer completely alone. The mockery, contempt, and attempts to belittle him hadn't broken his spirit. Now he saw that even in the harshest environment, allies could be found, and that gave him the strength to keep going. Kyle sat in his kitchen, sipping from a cup of cold coffee. Since the article had been published, his life had changed dramatically. But the most devastating blow hadn't come from his workplace. It came from where he least expected it. His phone rang. It was his brother's number. "Hey, Kyle." Marcus's voice was cold, distant. "We read your article. Mom's in shock. Are you really trying to ruin everything you've worked for? Do you understand they'll fire you?" Kyle sat in silence, unsure of what to say. He had always known that his family might not fully understand his fight. Marcus had always believed in simply getting the job done, thinking that the world couldn't be changed and it was better to adapt. But Kyle couldn't agree with that. "Marcus, you don't understand. This isn't just an article. This is a fight. The system is rotten, and someone has to start changing it." Kyle began to explain, but his words seemed to bounce off his brother. "You've always been an idealist, Kyle." Marcus cut him off. "But in the real world, your ideals aren't worth the price you're paying now. Mom's worried about you. We're all worried." This conversation shook Kyle. He had thought that those who knew him best would support his cause. But now, everything felt different. He started to doubt himself. Was this fight worth the cost he was facing? At that moment, Kyle felt more alone than ever. His family didn't understand, and his colleagues had turned their backs. The only option left was to keep fighting. But was that the right choice? The following week, Kyle struggled to find balance between his principles and his personal life. Each day, he returned home to an increasingly tense atmosphere. His wife, Kira, who was usually calm and supportive, had also begun to question his actions. "Kyle, I know you want to change the world, but think about us, about our lives," she said one evening as they ate dinner. Her voice was soft, but there was a hint of anxiety in it. "You see what this has led to. You have problems at work, and now even your family is worried. This isn't just your fight, it's ours too. Have you thought about that?" Kyle sighed heavily, feeling a wave of guilt. He had always believed he was doing the right thing, that his fight for justice was crucial for the future. But now he was confronted with another reality. His actions were affecting not just him, but also those closest to him. "I know this is hard," Kyle responded, looking at his wife with remorse in his eyes. "But I can't stop. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's for those who face injustice every day. I can't just let them keep doing what they're doing." Kira shook her head, silently. Her eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and fear. She knew why he was doing this, but she was also afraid of the consequences. This conversation only deepened Kyle's inner conflict. He knew he was risking everything: his job, his family's respect, their stability. But he also understood that if he stopped now, he would be betraying not only himself, but everyone who was counting on change. The next morning, Kyle woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. His fight wasn't just about him, it was something bigger. As he tried to navigate the delicate balance between his personal life and his public fight for justice, he realized that his actions had an impact not only on his career, but on all those who faced injustice. Back at the office, Kyle faced yet another challenge. The mocking from his colleagues had intensified. This time, Josh, one of the most openly hostile employees, approached Kyle's desk with a smirk on his face. "So, Kyle, still not tired of playing the hero? Everyone's saying you just want attention. Do you really think anyone cares about this fight of yours?" Josh sneered. Kyle lifted his gaze, his eyes calm and determined. He no longer felt anger or hurt at those words. Now, he understood that their mockery was just a defense mechanism for people afraid of change. "Maybe you're right, Josh," Kyle replied with a slight smile. "But I'm not doing this for attention, and you know that. I'm doing this for those who can't speak for themselves, and I'm not going to stop until something changes." Those words carried weight. Kyle had finally come to terms with the fact that his fight for justice made him an outsider to those who feared change. But that wouldn't stop him. He realized that losing the support of some people was a price he was willing to pay for the greater good. That evening, Kyle returned home, sat beside Kira, and took her hand. "I know this is tough, and I know you're worried," he said softly. "But this isn't just my fight. It's a fight for our future, for the future of everyone who faces injustice. If I back down now, what does that say about us? I want our child to grow up in a world where people can speak the truth and stand up for what's right." Kira was silent for a long time. Then she hugged him tightly. "I'll always be with you, Kyle. Just know that you're not alone," she whispered. In that moment, Kyle's doubts melted away. He was no longer questioning his path. He understood that the truth comes with sacrifice, but those sacrifices would lead to a better future for everyone. Kyle sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen, but his thoughts were far away. The recent conversation with the director and the warnings about potential sanctions had left a residue of anxiety in his mind. He knew that a corporate investigation was inevitable, but he hadn't expected it to start so soon. That morning, he received a message. He was summoned for questioning as a key witness in the investigation. The company's leadership wanted to find out who had leaked information for the article that raised questions about systemic racism within the company. Kyle felt the pressure mounting every day. His colleagues were becoming more distant, fearful of being drawn into the situation. He felt isolated and alone. Few dared to speak to him, and those who did either treated him with coldness or suspicion. He remembered his brother's words from a few days ago. "You're destroying your career." Those words echoed in his head, adding to his internal conflict. He doubted whether he was doing the right thing. "Maybe I should have stayed silent," Kyle asked himself, but quickly pushed the thought away. He knew he was on the right path, despite the fear of what might come. As he approached the office where the questioning would take place, Kyle's heart pounded in his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He wasn't just defending his actions, he was openly challenging a system built on oppression and injustice. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. Now, more than ever, he had to be honest. When Kyle entered the room, he was met with icy stares from several company representatives. The CEO, the head of HR, and the company lawyer sat behind a long table, hunched over piles of documents. The room was filled with tense silence, broken only by the muffled sound of office printers and the occasional clacking of keyboards outside. "Kyle, take a seat," the HR representative said coldly, motioning to the chair across from them. He sat down slowly, trying not to show his anxiety. His hands clenched into fists under the table to stop them from trembling. The people before him weren't just his bosses, they represented the very system he was fighting against. Their goal was to protect the company's image, even if it meant painting him as the villain. "We've begun an investigation regarding the leak of information related to allegations of racism in the company," the CEO continued. "And now, we need you to explain your role in this matter." Kyle nodded, trying to remain calm. He knew that at this moment, they would try to throw him off balance. "We understand you were involved in providing information to the journalists," the lawyer added, looking at him over his glasses. "But here's what we want to know. Why did you take these issues public instead of resolving them internally? It looks like an attempt to destabilize our workforce." The words hit Kyle like a shock. He knew they would try to twist the situation, making him look like the aggressor, but he couldn't let them overshadow the truth. "I tried to resolve these issues internally," Kyle began, "but no one listened to me. And it's not just about me. This is a system that's been in place for years. I've seen colleagues face discrimination, and nothing has changed. This isn't an isolated incident. That's why I decided to bring attention to it." The director's face remained expressionless, but a flicker of concern crossed his eyes. Kyle knew that he would face even more accusations, but a voice inside urged him to continue telling the truth. The conversation dragged on for over an hour. The company's leadership tried to use everything against him: his past mistakes, his work performance, to portray his actions as sabotage and a breach of corporate ethics. They tried to confuse him, suggesting that he acted selfishly by taking the issue outside the company. "Do you realize that your actions could jeopardize the jobs of many employees?" the HR head asked coldly. "This is a serious accusation, and the consequences could be catastrophic." Kyle sat there, listening to their accusations, and felt the anger building inside. They didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, that he was fighting not just for himself, but for those who remained in the shadows, afraid to speak about their pain. In that moment, Kyle realized that the corporate system would never accept the truth willingly. It would resist to the end, protecting its reputation and power. "I'm aware of the risks," Kyle replied, raising his gaze to the CEO. "But you need to understand one thing. I didn't do this for myself, and I didn't do it to destroy the company. I did it because no one should have to endure discrimination, racism, and injustice. And if it means I have to suffer for that, I'm willing to." The room fell into a stunned silence. His words seemed to catch everyone off guard. Kyle felt that something significant had happened. He had finally stopped being afraid. He realized that the truth, no matter how heavy, had a power that outweighed any pressure or threats. He knew there would be consequences, but he could no longer stay silent. "Well, we'll take your testimony into account," the CEO finally said, standing up. "But this doesn't mean we'll overlook your actions. There will be consequences." Kyle rose from his chair, feeling a strange sense of relief. He knew he had made the right choice, even though it might come back to haunt him. In that moment, he understood that the truth was the only path worth following. Let the consequences come. His voice would no longer be silenced. The day after giving his testimony, Kyle returned to the office with a strange mix of relief and anxiety. He knew that his words could affect the entire company, and he expected the management to try to sweep the matter under the rug. However, he wasn't prepared for the changes that had already begun among his colleagues. People who had once looked at him with mockery or distrust were now acting differently. They cast cautious glances his way, but the previous contempt was gone. Some seemed to be rethinking their initial assumptions, perhaps realizing that what Kyle had been speaking about wasn't baseless. A few even attempted to talk to him, but the conversations were short and formal. It felt as if his fight had begun to attract attention, even if that attention was still largely silent. Walking down the corridor, Kyle ran into Oliver, one of the few colleagues who had openly supported him from the start. "Kyle, hey," Oliver said cautiously, approaching him. "I heard you gave your testimony. That's a big step. How are you feeling?" Kyle nodded, trying to maintain his composure, though inside he still wrestled with doubt and anxiety. "I did what I had to do," he replied, looking at Oliver. "But the fight isn't over yet. You know they'll try to bury this." Oliver nodded silently, acknowledging the truth of Kyle's words. In that moment, Kyle realized that despite the temporary relief, he was still in the middle of a much larger battle. The system that resisted change wouldn't give up easily, and he had to be prepared for whatever came next. He could feel the tension growing within him, as if he were waiting for something bigger to come crashing down on him at any moment. Although the atmosphere around Kyle had shifted, he knew that the company leadership wasn't planning on publicly admitting the problem. Expecting the investigation to fizzle out quietly, Kyle noticed that some colleagues were once again distancing themselves from him. The managers avoided eye contact with him, as if the entire situation didn't exist. He realized that the company had chosen a strategy of silence, hoping the issue would disappear if they just ignored it. This silent conspiracy unsettled Kyle. His internal conflict deepened. On the one hand, he knew he was morally right, but on the other hand, he wasn't sure he had the strength to fight the system alone. He understood that without external support, it would be difficult to make real progress. It was at this point that his phone rang. It was the lawyer the journalist had introduced him to. They arranged to meet at a local cafe. "Kyle, I understand you're under a lot of pressure right now," the lawyer said as they sat down at a table. "But I can help. Your actions have already drawn attention from the press and civil rights organizations. You need support, and I'm prepared to offer it. We can fight this system together if you're willing to go all the way." Kyle felt a new fire igniting within him. This was the moment he had been waiting for, but also fearing. Alone, he could have broken under the weight of it all, but now he had a chance to ally with someone who could help him in his fight. He knew that accepting this help meant an even more serious confrontation with the company, but he had no choice. "I'm ready," Kyle replied quietly, feeling his resolve harden. "We can't stop now. This isn't just about me." After meeting with the lawyer, Kyle returned home, feeling his anxiety give way to determination. He now had a plan, and he was no longer alone. He knew that the battle ahead would be long and difficult, but with professional support, he felt more confident than ever. That evening, over dinner, Kyle decided to discuss his plans with Kira. "Kira, I met with the lawyer. He's ready to help me in this fight. We're going to get more media attention and put pressure on the company leadership," he said, looking into her eyes. Kira paused for a moment, processing what she had just heard. She understood that this could lead to even more problems for their family, but she also saw that Kyle had found his purpose in this struggle. "Kyle, I know how important this is to you," she began slowly, carefully choosing her words. "And I'll support you, no matter what happens. Just be prepared. It won't be easy. They won't give up without a fight." Kyle nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for her support. He knew that without her, it would be much harder for him. Now, he had allies, both professionally and personally. This gave him strength and confidence that he could achieve real change. The next day, Kyle returned to work with a new mindset. He knew there would be new challenges ahead, but now he had more resources to fight back. He no longer felt alone in all of this. The important thing now was to continue bringing attention to the issues and show that he wasn't going to back down. The management might try to bury the problem, but now Kyle knew that his voice would be heard. The system no longer seemed as impenetrable, and although the fight continued, he realized that with each step, he was getting closer to justice, not just for himself, but for all those who had faced oppression and discrimination within this office. Kyle sat in the silence of his apartment, staring at the papers scattered on the table. The long weeks of fighting were beginning to take a toll on his physical and emotional well-being. He felt the weight growing heavier every day, becoming almost unbearable. No amount of progress at work or support from outside could compensate for the internal exhaustion that was building inside him. With each new step against the company, he felt the pressure intensifying. The company was fighting back, using silence, psychological pressure, and cold indifference from some of his colleagues. Despite the support of the lawyer and a few allies, Kyle felt increasingly alone in the struggle. He couldn't understand why it had all become so difficult. When he first started, he had been full of resolve and belief in the rightness of his actions. But now, that belief was wavering. Every new day was a challenge, and every new obstacle made him doubt his strength. That evening, Kyle suddenly realized that he physically couldn't go on like this. The constant stress, sleepless nights, and overwhelming worries were sapping his motivation. He no longer knew if he could see this through to the end. For the first time since the fight began, the thought of giving up pierced his mind. Is this really worth the sacrifices? He wondered, staring into the emptiness. His phone vibrated, displaying his mother's name on the screen. Kyle sighed deeply and answered. "Kyle, honey." Her voice was full of concern. "Your brother and I have been talking a lot. Don't you think it's time to stop? This is causing too much pain for you, and for all of us." Kyle remained silent, feeling the pressure mounting. He knew his family was worried, but they didn't fully understand the depth of his fight. They didn't see the small but significant changes that were beginning to take place. "Mom, I can't stop," he replied quietly, though his words sounded almost like an excuse. "This is bigger than just my struggle. I have to keep going." But even as he spoke, he knew his resolve had weakened. In the following days, the situation worsened. The pressure at work intensified. He was openly warned that his continued involvement in the case could result in losing his job. The company began strategically undermining his professional competence. It wasn't just his actions in the fight for justice that were being questioned, but his entire career. The fatigue and doubt grew stronger. Every time he returned home, he was met with new conversations from loved ones trying to convince him to end the fight. Kira, though supportive in the past, had now begun to openly express her fears. "Kyle," she said one evening as he sat wearily at the table, staring at his papers, "I know this is important to you, but think about us. We've already lost so much. Your job is at risk. We could lose our stability. You don't even realize how much this is draining you." Kyle sighed, burying his face in his hands. Kira's words cut deep, but at the same time, he knew she was right. The fight was taking away his energy and time, and it was beginning to destroy everything around him. "I know it's hard for you," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I can't give up. If I stop now, what does that mean? That I'm not willing to go all the way for what I believe in?" Her eyes were filled with worry, and Kyle could feel the tension between them growing. He realized that his fight was starting to destroy not only his personal life, but also his relationships with the people closest to him. This was the moment when his internal struggle reached its peak. He was standing on the edge, unsure if he could take the next step. A week later, Kyle felt he could no longer keep everything inside. He decided to meet with Oliver, the colleague who had supported him from the beginning. They arranged to meet at a cafe after work. Kyle sat at the table, wondering how to share his fears without losing face. "Hey, Kyle," Oliver greeted him warmly as he sat down. "You look exhausted. Is everything okay?" Kyle gave a sad smile, leaning back in his chair. "Oliver, I'm just not sure if I can keep going," he admitted, opening up to someone for the first time in a long while. "This fight is tearing my life apart. My family is pressuring me. My job's on the line. I don't know if it's worth it anymore." Oliver listened carefully, not interrupting. When Kyle finished speaking, he responded, "Kyle, I understand how hard this is for you, but you've already achieved so much. People are starting to notice the changes. You're not alone in this, and even if it feels like everything's falling apart right now, Your actions matter." Those words unexpectedly filled Kyle with renewed strength. He realized that he wasn't alone in this fight, that there were people who saw his efforts and were willing to support him. "You're right," Kyle said, feeling a spark of hope ignite in his chest. "I can't stop now. I have to keep going." At that moment, as he spoke, Kyle felt his strength returning. He had been on the verge of giving up, but the support of true friends helped him find the energy he had been missing. He understood that even when the world seemed to be against you, real friends and allies could be the source of the energy you desperately needed. Kyle sat in his office, reflecting on the past few weeks. His fight for justice had led to some changes, but each step forward was met with new obstacles. His spirit was worn from the struggle, and the pressure hadn't let up. He knew the company was watching his every move, trying to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. Inside, he felt a storm of emotions: anger, frustration, exhaustion. He realized that his situation had become nearly unbearable. Continuing the fight meant risking not only his career, but also the financial stability of his family. Relatives continued to call, worried about his future, while colleagues, despite supporting him in words, avoided being around him too much. In this closed circle of loneliness, Kyle learned that the company had requested another meeting. The reason was vague, but he had a feeling they were going to try to stop him. When he arrived at the meeting, he was greeted by two people, the company's lawyer and a representative from the management team. They were friendly, but their eyes showed a cold calculation. After a short prelude, they got straight to the point. "Kyle, we understand that this situation has been difficult for both you and the company," the lawyer began with a strained smile. "But we want to offer you a solution that benefits everyone. You've contributed a lot to the company, and we don't want this conflict to destroy your career." Kyle listened carefully, but said nothing, waiting for them to continue. "We're prepared to offer you compensation," the lawyer continued, "a generous payout in exchange for your silence and resignation. You could start a new chapter in your life without all these conflicts and problems." The words hit Kyle like an electric shock. Money? They wanted to buy his silence? They were offering him a way out of all the difficulties for a price. But at that moment, he felt something inside him shift. This wasn't just about the money. His moral values stood against the lure of material gain. That evening, Kyle returned home with a heavy heart. The company's offer was tempting. Money could solve many problems and restore stability to his family's life. But at the same time, he knew that accepting it would be a betrayal of everything he had fought for. It would mean abandoning all the values he stood for. He sat on the couch, deep in thought, when Kira joined him. "You look troubled," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What happened?" Kyle looked up at her, his eyes filled with anxiety. "The company made me an offer," he said quietly. "They're offering money for my silence. I could leave, and all of this would be over." Kira paused, then sat down beside him and looked at him seriously. "And how do you feel about that?" she asked. Kyle ran his hands over his face, sighing. He couldn't make this decision lightly. On one hand, it would solve a lot of our problems. But on the other, it would mean I gave up. Everything I've been fighting for would be meaningless. I feel like I'd be betraying myself and everyone who believed in what I've been fighting for. Kira nodded, understanding his feelings. "I know this is hard for you, Kyle," she said softly. "But I'll support whatever decision you make. Just remember, money can't replace your conscience. You have to do what you believe is right." Those words sounded like a wake-up call. Kyle realized that his fight for justice was more important than any material gain. He couldn't allow himself to be bought, even if it would make life easier in the short term. The next day, Kyle went to work with a firm decision. He was set to meet the company's lawyer and representative again, and this time he was ready to give them his answer. His heart was calm. He knew he was making the right choice. When he entered the meeting room, the same faces greeted him with expectation. They clearly hoped for a positive response. "We're waiting for your decision, Kyle," the lawyer said, looking at him with a confident smile. "We hope you'll make the right choice for yourself and your family." Kyle looked at him, taking a deep breath. "I've made my decision," he began, his voice steady. "And my decision is no." The smiles vanished from their faces. The lawyer frowned, and the company representative stared at Kyle in confusion. "Are you sure?" the lawyer asked, clearly not expecting this turn of events. "This is a generous offer, Kyle. You could solve many of your problems." Kyle shook his head without hesitation. "Money won't buy my silence," he said firmly. "I don't sell my principles, and if you think money is more important than justice, that's your problem. I'm going to continue my fight and let everything I've done be heard." The silence in the room was deafening. Kyle knew that his decision might complicate his life, but now he felt that his honor and moral values had been saved. "If you thought you could buy me, you were wrong," he added, looking straight into the eyes of the company's representatives. "My fight isn't for money, it's for the truth." He left the room, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, Kyle felt real peace. He knew he had done the right thing, and now nothing could stop him on his path to justice. When Kyle first heard that his case had gained public attention, he was in his office, focused on working through a report. His phone vibrated on the desk, and a notification from a news site caught his eye. As he read the headline, a wave of mixed emotions, fear, pride, and surprise washed over him. "XYZ Corporation under fire. Investigation into employee discrimination," the headline proclaimed. The article mentioned his name and the fight he had begun months ago. Journalists, intrigued by the situation, had launched their own investigation, and it was now creating a stir in the media. The company was under pressure, not only from internal challenges, but also from public scrutiny. Kyle, who had become accustomed to fighting alone, suddenly realized that things were starting to change. His actions, which once seemed insignificant in the face of a massive corporation, were now making an impact. He scrolled through the comments under the article, noticing that people were split. Some supported him, while others questioned his motives. But the most important thing wasn't the opinions. It was that the truth he had been trying to share was finally being broadcasted nationwide. His heart raced, and his thoughts swirled. On one hand, he recognized that this newfound attention could be dangerous. Publicity always brought new threats. On the other hand, he finally saw that his voice was being heard, and that realization gave him renewed strength. The next day, the atmosphere at work had shifted dramatically. The company's leadership was preoccupied with managing the crisis sparked by the media coverage. No one pretended anymore that the problem didn't exist. Kyle could feel that all eyes were on him now, more than ever. Colleagues who once avoided or mocked him were now offering cautious support, though not openly. The mood was tense, but this tension worked in Kyle's favor. The company could no longer ignore what was happening. That afternoon, Kyle was called into the CEO's office. He expected a confrontation, but when he entered the spacious room, the atmosphere was different. The CEO, who had always been cold and distant, now appeared worried. Next to him sat the company's public relations officer. "Kyle, take a seat," the CEO began, gesturing to the chair in front of him. Kyle sat down, trying not to show his inner anxiety. "You know that this issue has gained significant public attention. The company is under pressure from both the media and the public. We can't ignore these accusations any longer," the CEO said, his voice tight with tension. Kyle remained silent, waiting for him to continue. We've decided to initiate a thorough internal investigation into all instances of discrimination. It will be a comprehensive review, and we aim to rid the company of any instances of injustice," the CEO added. Kyle felt his heart skip a beat. This was the moment he had been fighting for. The company was being forced to change its policies. However, he also knew that this was only the beginning. There was still much work to be done, and he couldn't let the investigation be just a formality to ease public pressure. "I hope you're serious about these changes," Kyle said quietly, not breaking eye contact with the CEO. "This isn't just about saving face. This is about real people who have suffered from discrimination for years." The CEO hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We understand that, Kyle, and if any violations are found, we will take action." Kyle left the office with a sense of victory, but knew that this was just the first step. He needed to stay vigilant to ensure that the investigation didn't turn into a mere PR stunt. When the investigation began, the company issued an official statement saying that all cases of discrimination would be thoroughly examined. This announcement sparked a new wave of discussions in the media, and Kyle's name once again appeared on news sites. He had become a symbol of the fight for equality in the corporate world. The pressure on the company was forcing it to act, but it was also putting a strain on Kyle. Every day, he became more aware that his actions had evolved beyond a personal fight. Now, he was the face of a broader movement, and people were placing their hopes on him. This gave him the motivation to continue, but it also brought a heavy sense of responsibility. One evening, Kyle met Oliver at a cafe to talk about the recent developments. "Do you realize that you're now a symbol of change?" Oliver asked, looking at him intently. "You're inspiring people to fight for their rights." Kyle nodded thoughtfully. He had felt it, but hadn't fully acknowledged it. "I never thought it would go this far," he admitted. "But now I see that if one person can spark change, it can inspire others. We all deserve justice, and I won't stop until we get it." Oliver smiled, agreeing with his words. "You're right, Kyle. You've shown that one person can challenge the system. The key is to never give up." Those words gave Kyle a renewed sense of confidence. He realized that his fight was no longer limited to the walls of one company. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by discrimination and injustice, but was now finding the courage to speak out. He was ready to go all the way, knowing that his actions could become the beginning of a larger movement. The room exploded with applause. Kyle sat still, feeling as if everything inside him was collapsing. His thoughts were scrambled, his hands trembling. "That's my project," he repeated to himself, like a mantra. When everyone left, Kyle stayed behind in the room. His heart was heavy like a stone. "How could this happen?" he whispered, staring at the blank wall. He could no longer remain silent. The determination that had been building up inside him over the past few weeks finally broke free. Kyle pulled out his phone and dialed his wife's number. He told her everything that had happened. She listened quietly, then, holding back her emotions, said, "You know what you need to do." Her words gave Kyle the confidence he needed. He knew he was right. He knew that silence could no longer be his weapon. At that moment, he made a decision. He would fight for justice. It would start with small steps, gathering more evidence, talking to other employees who might have faced similar injustices. He knew it could lead to confrontation, but now he was ready. Kyle understood that his battle wouldn't be easy, but he realized one thing. Only action could change the system in which he had long been just an observer. Now he was ready to become its destroyer.